I was sitting on the hard courtroom bench, knees bouncing, heart pounding louder than the murmurs all around. My name's Elijah Carter. 17. Not exactly the kind of teenager you'd expect to see in court, unless it was for honor roll or debate championships. But here I was. It started with a mistaken ID, a fight I wasn't part of, and a school officer who didn't care to listen. I wasn't angry, just confused. Everyone kept saying, it's a misunderstanding, but the way people were looking at me felt colder than that. That morning, I wore my navy blazer. My mom told me, look respectful. I always do. The judge hadn't arrived yet. The bailiff, a broad-shouldered man with a trimmed beard and stern eyes, kept staring. I didn't move. Just waited like the rest. Then it happened. He stepped toward me. You think this is a game? The bailiff said sharply. I looked up, startled. Sir. Next thing I knew, crack, his hand struck the side of my face. Gasps filled the courtroom. My mom screamed. And the doors behind us creaked open. Everyone turned. In walked a man in a dark gray suit, a federal badge clipped to his belt. He didn't yell. He didn't run. But something in the room changed instantly when he said, "Step away from my son. Now." The entire courtroom went silent, like someone hit pause on the whole world. The bailiff froze, his hand still half raised, as if time hadn't caught up with him yet. My cheek burned, but I couldn't look away from the man walking down the aisle with calm, deliberate steps. That man was my father, James Carter. To most people, just a name. But in federal circles, that name meant watch what you do next. He reached me, eyes scanning my face. You all right? He asked, barely above a whisper. I nodded slowly, too stunned to speak. Then he turned to the judge's assistant, who had risen from behind her desk. Call the U.S. Attorney's office, he said flatly. Tell them we'll need a federal investigator in this courtroom within the hour. The bailiff opened his mouth to say something, but my father cut him off with a look so sharp it could have sliced steel. You touched a minor. In custody. In front of 30 witnesses, he said coldly. Do you understand what kind of fire you just walked into? The bailiff's face went pale. My dad pulled out a small tablet from his inner coat pocket and tapped it. Body cams are off in this courthouse, aren't they? He said, not looking at anyone. Lucky for you, he added, turning the screen toward the room, I'm not fond of luck. On the screen was video. Clear. Close up. The moment the bailiff hit me, recorded from a hidden camera in my blazer button. The room held its breath again. The judge's chamber doors flung open, and Judge Ramirez stepped in, robe flowing behind him, clearly unaware of what he was walking into. What's going on in here? He asked sharply, scanning the room. One of the clerks rushed over and whispered something. His expression changed mid-sentence. My father remained still, standing beside me, his calm presence somehow louder than the chaos brewing around him. He didn't need to yell. He just waited. Judge Ramirez finally looked at the bailiff. Is this true? The bailiff stammered, he was being disrespectful. My dad raised the tablet higher. Is this your definition of discipline? He asked coolly. Because to me, this looks like assault. Ramirez exhaled through his nose. Mr. Carter, he said carefully, let's not escalate this. You escalated it when your officer laid hands on my son, my dad interrupted, voice still measured but razor-sharp. And now, we're going to handle it by the book. A low murmur ran through the spectators. Even the public defenders in the back row were sitting straighter now. My father pulled a small badge case from his jacket and opened it slowly. Gold and blue shimmered under the fluorescent lights. FBI, Internal Oversight Division. The judge's mouth parted slightly. You didn't think I'd come here unarmed, did you? My father said, folding the badge shut. This entire courtroom is under federal observation now. I looked around. 3 men in plain clothes had just entered from the back, moving like shadows, watching everything. They weren't here for a trial. They were here for cleanup. And it was just beginning. The tension in the courtroom turned electric. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly recalibrating. "Agent Carter," he said, using the title now, "I wasn't aware this case had federal interest." My father gave a humorless half-smile. "It didn't, until your officer crossed a line. Now it does." The plainclothes agents took positions near the doors. One of them quietly approached the bailiff and asked him to step aside. He hesitated, then obeyed, jaw clenched, eyes on the floor. "You'll be escorted to holding for now," the agent said flatly. "What?" "I was just doing my job," the bailiff snapped. "No," my father corrected him, "you were abusing your position. There's a difference." Everyone was watching. Every lawyer, every intern, even the security guard by the metal detector. Judge Ramirez finally spoke again, trying to regain control. "Let's not make this a spectacle." But my father turned toward him. "This is a spectacle, Your Honor. And it's one of your own making." The judge's gavel hovered in his hand, but he didn't strike it. My dad placed a protective hand on my shoulder. "My son came here in good faith. To clear up a mistake. Instead, he was treated like a threat before a word was spoken in his defense." Silence. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that the whole courtroom still heard him. "How many other kids walked through these doors and got treated the same way, without someone watching?" The room had no answer. But now, it had witnesses. And consequences. The courtroom, once just a space for routine hearings, now felt like the center of a reckoning. The plainclothes agents were already collecting statements from nearby witnesses. One even approached my mom, who still hadn't let go of her purse handle since I was slapped. "I want this off the docket," my father said calmly to the judge. "Immediately. My son should never have been brought in." Judge Ramirez cleared his throat. We can review the charges." My dad raised an eyebrow. "There are no charges. Just an incident report based on one unreliable witness and no physical evidence." He wasn't wrong. This all started because someone claimed I fit a description. That's it. Ramirez nodded stiffly. "Then I'll dismiss it. Effective now." The clerk at his side scribbled furiously into the court record. My dad turned to me. "We're done here," he said. But he wasn't finished. As we stood to leave, he looked around the room again. "I suggest this courthouse begins mandatory oversight training," he said, projecting to the judge, staff, and every badge in the room. "Because if this is how justice is handled when no one's looking, then I'll make sure someone is looking, every single day." The message wasn't just for today. It was for every courtroom that thought silence was safer than accountability. As we walked out, no one said a word. Not the judge. Not the clerk. Not the officers lining the wall. The man who hit me was gone. And the room he left behind had finally gone quiet, for all the right reasons. Outside the courthouse, the sun hit my face like a reset button. The air felt different. Lighter. Like I could breathe again. Reporters had already gathered on the steps. Somehow, word had spread. Cameras pointed. Microphones angled toward us. But my dad didn't slow down. He placed his hand on my back and guided me past them. "Agent Carter, is it true your son was assaulted in court? Will there be charges against the officer? Is the FBI launching a broader investigation?" My father didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The silence behind him was louder than any headline. We reached the car. As we got in, he finally looked at me, not as an agent, not as a man in a suit, but just as a dad. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said quietly. "But I promise you, it stops here." And I believed him. Because I saw what happened when power met accountability. Because I watched the room shift when truth walked in wearing a badge of its own. And because that day in court, what started as humiliation ended with a message none of them would ever forget: some people wear badges to intimidate. Others wear them to protect. Only one kind belongs in a courtroom. A week later, we got a letter. Stamped with the Department of Justice seal, it confirmed what my dad had predicted: an internal inquiry had been launched into courtroom conduct at that district. The bailiff who struck me, suspended without pay pending formal charges. The judge, under review for procedural negligence. But that wasn't the part that stuck with me. What stuck was the message that had started to ripple outward. Emails came in, quiet, respectful ones, from parents I'd never met, lawyers who'd seen too much, even students who'd had their own brushes with silence in courtrooms just like that one. They all said the same thing: thank you for not letting it slide. I never asked to be the center of anything. I was just trying to clear my name. But something bigger happened that day, because someone finally stood up in the very room where people are told to sit down and stay quiet. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every kid who sat in that courtroom, wondering if anyone was watching. Now they know, someone is. 2 weeks after the courtroom incident, my name came up somewhere I didn't expect, at a school board meeting. My mom had been quietly pushing for answers, and apparently, others had too. What happened in that courtroom triggered more than a federal review, it triggered a community awakening. Parents showed up. Teachers spoke. Even a local principal admitted something we'd all known but rarely heard aloud: some of our students are treated like suspects before they're treated like children. The room was packed. One board member hesitated before speaking. This wasn't a school matter. It happened in court. My mom stood up calmly and said, it started at school. When my son was accused without evidence. When no one bothered to question the claim, just the kid. And then, to everyone's surprise, my father entered from the back of the room. He hadn't planned to speak. But when the mic opened up, he walked forward in silence. I've worked in federal law enforcement for 19 years, he said. And let me be very clear, if we're more comfortable profiling teenagers than protecting them, we've lost the plot. He paused, let that sit, and then added, this isn't about courtrooms. It's about culture. And culture starts here. The room went quiet again, just like it had that day in court. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was realization. That moment didn't just belong to us anymore. It belonged to the entire city. And it was already changing everything. A month later, I was invited to speak on a local radio show, something small but widely respected in our city. They wanted to talk about youth, justice, and accountability. I almost said no. But my father encouraged me. You don't have to be loud, he said. Just be clear. So I went. The host, Ms. Palmer, was kind and calm, the kind of person who made a mic feel less like a spotlight and more like a conversation. Elijah, she asked, what was going through your head when the officer struck you? I thought about that moment for a long beat. Honestly? I said. I wasn't surprised. Her eyebrows raised. I've learned that sometimes you can do everything right, dress right, speak right, act right, and still be seen as a problem, I continued. But what shocked me wasn't that it happened. It was how quickly the truth shut it down when someone actually had the power to speak. Ms. Palmer leaned in. You mean your father? I nodded. Yeah. But it shouldn't take someone's badge to make people care. There was a long pause on the airwaves. And then she said something I'll never forget, maybe that's the point. Maybe your voice, your story, is what gives the next kid power, even without a badge. I didn't say anything after that. I didn't need to. For once, just being heard was enough. 6 months later, the bailiff pled guilty to misconduct. No trial. No long legal drama. Just accountability, finally, and officially. The court district announced new policies. Security staff would undergo mandatory de-escalation training. All minors would be accompanied by an advocate or guardian. And most importantly, the courtroom would no longer be treated like a zone of unchecked authority. It didn't fix everything. But it changed something. At school, things were quieter. Some teachers treated me differently, not out of fear, but with a kind of guarded respect. A few even apologized. But I didn't carry bitterness. I carried awareness. I understood now how thin the line could be between being heard and being harmed. Between silence and justice. Between power misused, and power finally used right. As for my dad, he never boasted about what he did. Never used it for attention. He just reminded me of one thing every time I left the house: you don't need to be perfect, Elijah. You just need to be prepared. And know you have the right to be treated like you belong. Because I do. And now. So does every other kid who walks through that courtroom door, knowing someone stood up, and made it safer than how they found it. Months passed, and life settled back into something close to normal, at least on the outside. But one fall afternoon, I returned to that same courthouse. Not in handcuffs. Not accused. But invited. The city had launched a new youth advisory panel to help reform courtroom policies, and they asked me to be on it. At first, I thought it was symbolic, some PR move. But when I walked into that conference room and saw a table full of students, teachers, legal advocates, even a few former skeptics, I realized something had shifted for real. They listened. They asked questions. They wanted to know how to make the system safer for people like me. And when it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I'm not here because I'm special, I said. I'm here because someone finally saw me as equal. That should have happened from the start, not after a federal badge showed up. There were no cameras. No microphones. Just quiet nods. Honest faces. After the meeting, a young kid from another school walked up to me. Couldn't have been more than 14. Nervous. Soft-spoken. You're the guy from the radio, right? I smiled. Yeah, that was me. He nodded slowly, then said, thanks. I didn't know people like us could push back. I looked at him and said, you can. You just need one voice to remind you. And maybe, just maybe, that voice was mine now. A year to the day after that courtroom incident, we stood in front of the building again. Not to protest. Not for a hearing. But for a dedication. The city had decided to rename the Youth Advocacy Wing of the courthouse. They called it, the Carter Initiative for Equal Justice. There was no stage, just a modest podium and a bronze plaque. My mom cried quietly. My dad stood beside me, silent and proud. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't talk about the slap. Or the fear. Or even the badge that shut the room down. I talked about what came after. About kids who wrote letters saying they finally felt seen. About judges who requested training themselves. About classrooms where civics wasn't just a subject, but a lived experience. I didn't want any of this, I told the crowd. But I realized something along the way: we don't always get to choose the moment that finds us. But we do get to choose what we do with it. And then I smiled, not for the cameras, not for the press, but for every kid who'd ever sat in silence and thought they had no voice. Because that day in court didn't break me. It built something bigger. And now, the door to that courthouse opens a little wider than it used to. Because someone pushed. And refused to be pushed back.